Okay, Robert, you played a great game of chess against the iPad, so we'll play the moves here, and you can explain to people why you did it, okay? Pawn to e4, why'd you play that?
Because it's part of the joke.
Okay, and he said pawn to a6, and you said knight to f3, why?
Because it's part of the joke.
That's right, okay, and he played pawn to c6, and you played bishop to c4, right? Why?
Because it's to develop my bishop, and it's part of the joke.
That's right, okay, and he said pawn to d6, and you said pawn to c3.
Part of the Joko.
Still Joko, and knight to f6, and you said pawn to d3. Why'd you do pawn to d3?
Part of the Joko.
And is there another reason
Oh,
why?
and to protect my
That's
pawn.
right. And he said pawn to c5, and then you said castle kingside. Why'd you castle kingside?
To get my team to safety.
That's
and
right.
Part of the Joko.
Awesome. And he said knight to c6, and then you said bishop to f4. Why'd you move bishop to f4?
To develop my bishop.
And he said knight takes pawn. You said pawn takes knight. Why'd you recapture? Obviously,
to get material.
to win the material.
And
He said, yep. And
and
he
to
said pawn to a5. You said knight to d2. Why'd you go knight to d2?
To develop my knight.
That's right, right on. And he said pawn to f6. And then you said rook to e1. Why'd you
To get
move?
a start to develop my
Yep.
developing my rook.
Yep. And he said pawn to h5. And you said pawn to a3. I guess you're just pushing that pawn up, right?
Yeah.
And then he said pawn to b6. And then you said pawn to b4. Why'd you say pawn to b4 there? Do you remember?
Yeah.
What was the deal?
I wanted to try and march my pawns.
Okay.
down.
All right. So he says knight takes pawn. Silly move on his part. You said pawn takes knight from the A file, and he says pawn takes pawn on the C file to the B. And now you actually moved rook to C1. No, you actually moved rook to C1. Why'd you move rook to C1?
Because so I could protect my pawn.
That's right.
But the best thing to do is move it to B1, so that way I can take.
Here's what he did.
takes,
Okay,
and then I
okay,
take.
okay. But he takes pawn, and then obviously you recaptured with the rook, right? Rook takes pawn. Where are we here? So rook takes pawn, and then he says bishop to b7, and then you say rook to e3, okay? And then he says queen to c7, and then you said knight to b3. Why'd you do knight to b3 there?
I want to threaten a pawn.
Okay. And he says queen takes bishop, obviously a
I think
blunder.
how to develop my knight.
Okay, all right. He says queen takes bishop. You said rook takes queen. Why?
Oh, just the one material.
That's right. Okay, and he says bishop takes pawn. And we're getting closer here. He said bishop takes pawn. You said rook from e3 recaptures the bishop, obviously to get material, right?
Yeah.
Good move there. And then he says pawn to e6. Okay. And then you said queen to d4.
Even though I could have taken the pawn.
You could have queen to
But
d4.
it
Why'd you
would
move queen to d4?
To just, to just try and develop my queen.
Okay, getting your queen in the game. He says rook to h6. Queen to d4, rook to h6. And you said bishop takes rook. Why?
Wait, let me think about
Bishop
that.
takes rook. Why'd you do bishop?
Oh, to win material.
Of course, it's a winning exchange. And he said pawn takes bishop, right? And then you said queen to e3. Why'd you put your queen on e3 here, Robert? Why'd you
To get them on the same file.
get them filed up on the same file? Okay, and then he said king to d7. Great. And then you said rook takes pawn. Why'd you do rook takes pawn?
There's one material.
Yeah, because he can't recapture, right? Free pawn. Rook takes pawn. He says rook to d8. And almost done here, pawn to h3, right?
Closing in on it.
Yep, you're closing in. Pawn to h3, and then he does pawn to h4. Okay, and why'd you do this? Why'd you do rook takes pawn here, Robert? Robert.
Now what? Wait,
What? Okay, all right. Why did you do rook takes pawn right here?
Just one more material.
One more material, okay. And he says pawn to d5. He's trying to threaten your rook, right? Pawn to d5, and you said rook to c3. Why?
Well, to support my king.
No, you got your rook away from the capture, right? Rook to c3, and then he said rook to a8, and getting close to the mate here. You said knight takes pawn. Knight takes the pawn on h, I guess. Then he said bishop to b4. He's trying to threaten your rook here again. Bishop to b4, right?
Yeah.
You said rook to c2. Why?
To get my rook away from
And he said rook to a6. And then you said, this is where you made a really good move. You said rook to f7, check, right? What are you thinking at this point in the game?
Squeegee him.
You squeeze, you getting into a checkmate pattern, right?
Yeah.
He said king to d8. And you remember what you did here? You said rook to e2. Why'd you do that? Great move. Why'd you do that?
You're right, okay.
Why'd you move rook to e2, bud?
To support my queen so I can move there. Because if I just move it there, I don't shoot him.
See, he does pawn to a4, threatening your knight. And you said, you remember what you did?
No.
Queen to e8. And what is that?
Mate.
Checkmate.
So you can't checkmate. So he
That's
can't
right.
take my
You got
knight.
him. You got him checkmate.
So he can't take my knight.
Yep. Can't